and welcome to our webinar. Today, we'll cover ISO 20022, Payment Messages in the U.S. I'm Jean Rourke with the Federal Reserve, and I'll be your facilitator. All right, we'll jump to slide 2 to talk about logistics of our call today. This call is being recorded and will be made available at fedpaymentsimprovement.org at a later date. If you haven't done so yet, click on the webinar link you received after registering. This option offers a few benefits. You can watch the slides as they are advanced. You can type questions to us. You can download a PDF version of today's presentation, and you can even choose to listen to the audio through your PC speakers. I would like to note that the webinar performance does depend on your connection, so if at any time you're having problems, just pick up the phone and dial in to the toll-free number. Now then, let me be the first to welcome and thank our presenter. Joining us from the New York Federal Reserve is Gina Russo. As I mentioned earlier, you can submit questions for Gina at any time by clicking the Ask Question button in the webinar tool. We'll be addressing those questions at the end of our call. And with that said, we're ready to move to slide 3, and I will turn it over to Gina.
Thank you, Jean. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Gina Russo, and I'm with the Federal Reserve Bank of New York in the Wholesale Product Office. And within the Wholesale Product Office, we manage the FedWire Fund Service, the FedWire Security Service, and the National Settlement Service. Today's webinar will focus on ISO 20022 payment messages in the context of wire transfer and ACH systems in the U.S. So other types of payments, securities, checks, payment cards, etc., will be out of scope for the discussion. I will first provide an overview of what ISO 20022 is and show an example. Then we will spend a good part of today's webinar focusing on an overview of the business case assessment that was conducted in late 2013 to consider ISO 20022 adoption for wire transfer and ACH systems in the U.S. Then we will walk through some ISO 20022 use cases for wire transfer systems. And then we will not be discussing, though, ISO 20022 use cases for ACH systems because NACHA is leading a separate effort with their Payments Alliance group to create use cases for ACH. So really today's discussion beyond the business case assessment overview is really going to be focused on just wire transfer systems. So turning to the next slide, I just wanted to spend a few minutes talking about the payment strategies paper that the Fed published in January 2015. So this paper incorporated extensive feedback from the industry, and it outlines desired outcomes and strategies for improving the payment system in the U.S. So Strategy 4, as noted on this slide, focuses on achieving greater end-to-end efficiency for domestic and cross-border payments. And if you turn to the next slide, within Strategy 4, there is a specific objective to develop an implementation strategy for the application of the ISO 20022 standard to U.S. payment transactions. And the ISO 20022 strategy will consider the elements presented here on the slide. And these are the elements that came out of the business case assessment conducted in late 2013, which I will walk through in a few minutes. But before we get to the business case assessment, it's important to level set on what the ISO 20022 standard is. So let's turn to the next slide. And I just want to spend a few minutes providing an ISO 20022 overview for those of you that may be less familiar with this standard. So just starting about what is ISO. So ISO is the International Organization for Standardization. It's a network of national standards bodies that develop international standards, and the U.S. contributes to ISO through the American National Standards Institute. And ISO develops standards for many industries, and the ISO 20022 standards are the ones that relate to financial messaging across major financial services domains. So within ISO 20022, It's a harmonized set of XML financial messaging standards. So there's a set of standards for payments, securities, trade, card, and FX. And we'll be focusing on the ones for payments today on the call. But ISO has a shared data dictionary and business process model so that there's a common language being followed for all the different types of financial messages. There are open standards made available to all members of the financial services community. And the messages themselves are created using a standard-specific methodology. And the ISO 20022 payment messages are the foundation of SWIFT's future standards development for their SWIFT MX messages. So right now, SWIFT has the MT messages, and they have created MX messages, which are ISO messages. Moving on to the next slide. So ISO 20022 for payments, it's a robust standard with room for additional payment-related information that supports the end-to-end flow of information about a payment from the originator to the beneficiary. So there's a set of ISO 20022 messages for the payment initiation aspect, so from the corporate to the bank, and then the interbank settlement aspect, which is the bank-to-bank transfer, and then from the cash management side, from the bank to the corporate. So within these ISO 20022 messages, there are common fields across all the different messages that can be carried throughout the payment chain, so that end-to-end flow. These standards are being adopted by a number of the world's payments, clearing, and settlement systems, and we'll talk about that more in a little bit. And SWIFT has created an app for the iPad that you can download at the App Store that will show you the ISO adoption efforts across the world. There's a growing interest, of course, from financial institutions, corporates, and financial application providers. And SWIFT partnered with the industry to actually create an ISO for Dummies document, which can be downloaded for free at SWIFT's website. And that just provides basic information about what ISO is and how it's created and how the methodology for creating the standards and things like that. So it's a very good resource. Moving on to the next slide. So in this slide, we're just providing a very basic example of what the ISO 20022 message format looks like. And for those of you that are Fedwire or CHIPS customers, you know that we have a proprietary message format that, while it's very mappable to each other, we do have our own unique format. Our format is also mappable to the SWIFT MT format, but again, it is a proprietary format. So within Fedwire and CHIPS, as an example, we have address lines. And we each have up to 3 address lines that are up to 3 characters each, and it's really free text can go in these fields. And we have these address lines for all of the different parties that can be carried in the wire transfer message. So within that, there's no discrete place to put a street number, a street name, a city, a state, a country code, and specific address attributes. Because, again, it's free text. But within the ISO 20022 format, as you can see here on slide 8, ISO has discrete fields that are very clear of what should be contained within those fields. So it's very clear of where you should put a street number, a street name, a postal code, a town name, and a country code. And we'll talk later when we get into the use cases, but having discrete fields, especially for name and address information, is very helpful with compliance screening. So moving on to the next slide. Now we're going to spend a good amount of time talking about the business case assessment that was done in 2013. And really what led us to conduct a business case assessment is because we knew that several major markets around the world had either already adopted ISO or had announced that they were moving towards ISO in response to either regulatory mandates, development of new systems or technology upgrades, or a combination of the three. And we wanted to determine whether or not U.S. payment markets should also adopt ISO to remain competitive. And what we did in the U.S. was we formed a stakeholder group to address the question of whether or not we should adopt ISO. And the stakeholder group members are the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, the Clearinghouse Payments Company, which operates the CHIPS wire transfer system. NACHA was also part of the stakeholder group, as well as X9. And so we partnered together to hire an independent consultant to do an objective business case assessment for whether there was a business case for or against adoption of ISO in the U.S. And the scope of the business case assessment, it considered both domestic and cross-border payments for Fedwire funds, CHIPS, Fed ACH, and EPN. So we were looking at both the wire transfer systems as well as the ACH systems and the customers of those systems, so the banks, as well as their corporate customers, so that we would look at the end-to-end payment flow of wire transfers and ACH payments. And the consultant released its report to the stakeholder group in April of 2014. And moving on to the next slide, to give you a sense of the scope and approach for the business case assessment, it was broken up into three segments. There was a global scan that included interviews with participants in other jurisdictions that have either adopted ISO or have activities underway to adopt ISO. There was a U.S. industry scan, which there were web-based surveys and phone interviews conducted. And then finally, there was the negative business case, where they looked at the impact of not adopting ISO in the U.S. So what would happen if we chose not to adopt ISO? Moving on to the next slide. Some of the key observations from the global scan, they broke out the participants globally into three categories. So they looked at mature adopters, which are in Europe, as an example, the SEPA implementation. They looked at growing adopters, which included the countries here noted on slide 11. And then they also looked at interested adopters, which those are ones that have commitments to do ISO or they're undergoing assessments to do ISO. And those are the countries here noted on slide 11. So in looking at all these different segments, what they saw as drivers for adoption, in all cases, the adoption was driven by one or more of the following. So either a regulatory mandate, a technology upgrade, a system consolidation, or a new system being developed. So no one really went out to adopt ISO just for the sake of updating the message format. The decision to go with ISO was in conjunction with other efforts underway within the jurisdictions. And there were also some other considerations as well. As they were considering ISO, they were looking at ways to automate manual processes and glean efficiencies by doing so. And they were also looking at how ISO could be used to improve the quality and quantity of data carried within the payment messages. Some lessons learned on the next slide from the global scan. So in talking with all the different jurisdictions and all the different categories of adopters, there were some common themes. And number one, communication and education are critical. Establishing a unified regional target end date is key. One key finding was that simply replacing the current format with the ISO version So a like-for-like approach would not drive full benefits of ISO. However, we do know that a like-for-like approach is being followed in other jurisdictions. But there is concern, of course, about just, simply stopping there won't glean the full benefits of ISO. We also learned that that folks were using this as an opportunity to map the end-to-end process flow using the ISO methodology. They also said that adoption should include both payment and reporting messages. So again, looking at that end-to-end payment chain. And that adoption strategy should include translation and enrichment services for end users. And then, of course, finally, the use of a single message implementation guide would help reduce cost and risk. So making it very clear to your market, what you're doing, how you're adopting, how you should interpret the messages, that kind of thing is very important in any adoption strategy. So now moving on to the U.S. industry scan on slide 13. So in doing the online survey and the phone interviews with U.S. participants, some common themes also emerged. One was there was inconsistent demand. So really what they found was that the current demand really resides among the global banks and the large corporations, particularly for cross-border payments, because those segments are involved in ISO adoption efforts for other markets that they participate in. And smaller institutions, however, they maintain a general satisfaction with the status quo. And there was a lack of awareness and understanding of ISO. So again, similarly, the larger banks and corporations had an awareness and understanding, while smaller institutions were less aware of the standard and understood what it was. There was an unclear interoperability value proposition, meaning that many felt that the value of interoperability would be gleaned more by organizations involved with global reach, whereas those with domestic-based operations would question the benefit of interoperability, because from their perspective, things were working just fine with the message formats we currently have. And then another question around interoperability was raised regarding, given the number of global variants out there associated with ISO 20022, because the way it's an open standard and it can be implemented in different ways in different jurisdictions. So if everyone's doing it differently, then how do you really have a standard, and how can it really be interoperable? So there were questions around that. And then another thought was around the extended remittance information efforts in the U.S. Despite existing capabilities, ERI adoption, especially among the wire transfer systems, when we introduced ERI capabilities back in November 2011, the adoption of that capability has been low, and so they question, how will this be any different? And then finally, U.S. participants raised the notion that lack of industry or regulatory mandate would make it difficult for them to advance ISO adoption efforts. Moving on to the next slide. The business case assessment also took a look at potential benefits of ISO 20022 adoption in the U.S., and again, this is for wire transfer systems and ACH systems. And they looked across different segments. So they looked at market infrastructures, meaning the Fed and the clearinghouse, financial institutions, and then corporations. And you'll see the benefits here listed on slide 14, and it's showing how these benefits could actually apply to everyone in the payment chain. Moving on to slide 15. The business case assessment also looked at potential cost of moving towards ISO 20022 adoption. And clearly the costs they're difficult to quantify, and they will vary according to technology, implementation, vendors, and training. And one of the frustrating things about the business case assessment is that it was very difficult to glean cost estimates for ISO 20022 adoption, because what we learned is that ISO 20022, as I mentioned earlier, was incorporated into broader strategies. So it wasn't just a standalone effort. It was part of other things, and therefore it was difficult to isolate the cost for ISO. And then also there were markets that were less comfortable sharing information around cost. So we really didn't, we were not able to really get a financial business case or cost estimates out of the business case assessment. On slide 16, the third component of the business case assessment was taking a look at the negative business case. So what would happen if we didn't adopt ISO in the U.S. and just maintain the status quo with our legacy formats? And so the consultants found that innovation could be hampered by not updating our formats at the same pace as other markets around the world. They also raised concerns around how loss of global interoperability with other markets could impact the competitiveness of U.S. corporates and banks engaged in global trade, as well as even the attractiveness of the U.S. dollar as a global currency. It also could result in increased costs and inefficiencies in having to maintain multiple formats and legacy systems, especially for banks that are moving towards ISO in other markets, them having to maintain the cost associated with the legacy formats in the U.S. as well as the ISO formats abroad. And then finally, there could just be an overall negative global perception of the U.S. as an outlier resistance to change. So if other markets and economies around the world are moving towards ISO and we aren't, there are certain, risks that could happen. It's not certain that it would happen, but these were the risks that the consultant raised as part of the negative business case. And then in conclusion on slide 17, so the bottom line conclusion after all the information was that the benefits are largely qualitative at this point and haven't fully been realized. So even among those that are more advanced in their adoption efforts, like in the SEPA community, they're still realizing the benefits. And then, of course, for others that are in process of adopting or haven't actually started yet, even though they may have plans, they have not achieved the benefits of ISO yet. And as I mentioned, it was very difficult to get information on cost and a financial benefit associated with ISO. So it was very difficult to define an overarching financial business case at the industry level, because in all cases what we saw globally was that upgrade to ISO in other markets was part of a broader technology project or regulatory mandate, and as I mentioned previously, other markets were reluctant to share this information with the consultant. However, nevertheless, there is momentum for ISO adoption, particularly among the large global banks and corporations. And while there may not be a compelling financial business case at this time in the U.S., the consultant identified a number of strategic reasons that we should consider adoption. Moving on to slide 18. So the next two slides go into the strategic reasons that we should consider ISO adoption for U.S. wire transfer and ACH systems. I'm not going to go through each of them here because in a few minutes I'm going to be delving into specific use cases around these themes for wire transfer systems. So we'll be touching on these strategic reasons as we go through the use cases. But they're presented here on slide 18 and 19 for your information. So if we move on now to slide 20. So in addition to the conclusion provided by the consultant also presented some recommendations that the U.S. should consider. They recommended that we employ a phased approach to ISO adoption to reduce risk and cost, and then also to better educate and plan with the industry. The stakeholder group agreed to conduct an assessment to identify specific use cases that could be addressed by ISO, and I'll be speaking about those use cases for wire transfer systems in a minute. But the main recommendations provided by the consultant was in a phased approach. Phase one would be the planning and education phase, which is really what we're in right now and what we're trying to accomplish through these webinars, is we're promoting ISO 20022 educational efforts and developing a national strategy for adoption. And then in phase two, the consultant suggested we consider enabling ISO for cross-border wire payments, followed by cross-border ACH payments. And then as a third phase, once we accomplished ISO for cross-border payments, we would then revisit and take a look at whether or not it made sense to also consider ISO adoption for domestic wire payments and ACH payments. And then finally, as an additional consideration, the consultant recommended that if we were to develop anything new in the U.S., as an example, a new faster payment system, that we would use ISO 20022 as the standard messaging format. And so with that consideration, my understanding is that the clearinghouse who is proposing a new faster payment system, that they would be doing it in the ISO 20022 format. So there's an example right there of how that additional consideration would be applied. The consultant's business case executive summary is available on NACHA's website. So NACHA is one of the stakeholder group members, and they volunteered to host the executive summary report on their website. But you do have to establish a user ID and password to log into the website and agree to terms of use in order to download the report. But it is available to anyone that establishes a user ID on NACHA's website. So moving on to slide 21. So since April 2014, when the stakeholder group received the report from the consultant, the stakeholder group has presented the outcome of the business case assessment at various industry conferences, including CIBOS, which was last September. And of course, there's a lot of industry a lot of interest around the world about what the U.S. is doing as far as ISO. And so I think, there's an expectation for this year about what the next steps are. So in addition to just presenting general information about the business case assessment, in September of 2014, the Fed and the Clearinghouse had a joint meeting with our advisory group banks, and we started talking about not just the business case assessment, but taking it a step further to start thinking about implementation strategies, and even high-level timelines of when we think we could accomplish ISO for wire transfer payments in the U.S. And the focus of that meeting was wire transfers and not ACH, but we did touch on ACH as well. And the key takeaways from that meeting was that there was general consensus among the global banks around the intention to adopt ISO, and that wasn't necessarily a surprise because that was also a finding from the the consultant's business case assessment. So while there was consensus, of course, the means and the timing had not yet been determined. The group agreed that given the lack of a financial business case and a regulatory mandate at this point, it was very critical that use cases be developed to articulate the benefits of ISO, and that, we really needed to engage others beyond the global banks into the planning efforts, because if we were to move towards ISO, especially for the Fed, we have a very broad community that we represent, and we represent, all different sized banks, and so we have to think through, the right implementation approach, because it would affect all of our customers. One of the key findings, though, from this discussion is it was pretty unanimous that despite the consultant's recommendation, where we do cross-border first and then domestic payments, that we really shouldn't consider a strategy that way, that we shouldn't separate the implementation, and rather, because banks are talking to their customers for both domestic and cross-border payments, it really didn't make sense to support one format for one type of payment and another for the other. So the group really was recommending that we don't separate the cross-border and domestic implementation, and that we consider ISO for all payments, so all wire together, followed by all ACH together. And there seemed to be an interest to move towards ISO adoption for wire transfer payments before moving to ACH payments. The group did discuss several implementation approaches at a very high level, but it was clear that more discussion was needed to really dive deep into the pros and cons and timing. So in regard to the use cases, the stakeholder group recently finalized use cases for how ISO could benefit wire transfer systems, and we're going to move on to the next slide, where I'm going to talk through several of those use cases. So on slide 22. So again, just to remind folks, the next several slides are really focused on use cases for ISO 20022 for wire transfer systems in the U.S. And as I mentioned earlier, NACHA is working with its Payments Alliance Group to develop use cases for ACH systems, and those use cases aren't yet finalized. However, I will share that some of these use cases do overlap and can also be applied to ACH systems as well. So the way the use case is laid out, within each use case, what we're showing is, the use case is presented in the first column. The next column describes the limitations of the current wire formats, and then the third column describes how ISO can benefit. So in this first use case on slide 22, this is the compliance use case, so compliance with both domestic and global regulatory requirements. So in the current wire formats today, as many of you know, the name is limited to 35 characters, and this can lead to either data truncation or carryover data being mapped to other free text fields in FedWire and CHIPS. So if you have someone with a very long name, it won't fit into the current name field, and you're having to break up the name into more than one field. And then also, as I noted in that first example that I provided at the beginning of the webinar, both FedWire and CHIPS have free text address fields. There's no discrete field for a country code, and this makes regulatory screening more difficult for sanctioned countries. So as a benefit, what ISO 20022 provides is, as you know, that complete originator and beneficiary name and address information is critical when you're doing your regulatory screening, and ISO 20022 has characteristics that make it easier to identify the full name and address in the payment message. So specifically, ISO includes consistent user-friendly field names, and has discrete fields to support specific data elements, several of which are critical for proper regulatory screening. So as in the example that we provided at the beginning, ISO has those structured address fields, including a country code, which could help with regulatory screening. ISO also provides for longer name fields, so it can support a name of up to 140 characters, and that can also assist with regulatory screening and can improve straight-through processing because you're not having to break up the name into multiple fields. And so these tools can provide banks that are acting as intermediaries an effective way to identify missing information and cross-border transfers, enable them to take actions to respond to evolving regulatory requirements in other markets, such as the FAT of 16 requirements. It can help them respond to that more timely. So as the next use case example on slide 23, so this use case is related to domestic interoperability between the U.S. wire systems and SWIFT. So as you know, Fedwire, CHIPS, and SWIFT all have proprietary message formats. And while the formats are mostly interoperable, each format has its own unique field tag names and characteristics. So banks that participate in more than one system must maintain mapping routines to ensure that data is mapped correctly between systems. And then whenever changes are made, banks have to update all systems or develop market conventions for mapping between systems that haven't changed. And a good real-life example coming up is that SWIFT, for those of you that are SWIFT participants, in November of 2015, SWIFT is going to be implementing a new format option for their beneficiary field. It's the option F. And both Fedwire and CHIPS are not implementing the similar option in their respective formats. So banks are going to have to figure out a market convention for how they can map an option F formatted beneficiary into the free text name and address fields of the Fedwire and CHIPS formats. So that's a real-life example of how, when you're having, three different formats, banks that are participating in these different systems have to, map between the systems and make sure that data can be carried from one system to another so that there's not data truncation and data loss. So, of course, moving to a common format for both systems in the U.S., that would be compatible with SWIFT, so the SWIFT MX messages, which are ISO messages. If everyone was on a common format, it could reduce or eliminate the gaps between the different systems, and then the need for banks to maintain mapping routines to accommodate the different formats. Moving on to slide 24. So this use case relates to cross-border interoperability. So as other markets outside of the U.S. are adopting ISO, banks and their corporate customers engaged in global trade, they're going to need to make changes to accommodate the ISO upgrades in other markets. So, of course, again, this is where, as pointed out in the business case assessment, there is more demand among the global banks and the global corporations to adopt ISO because they're having to do it anyway for the other markets that they participate in. So the lack of the cross-border interoperability, it could lead to more cross-border payments migrating to offshore dollar clearing arrangements that are capable of conducting transactions in the ISO format. So as other, we know that there are offshore arrangements out there today. If those arrangements move to ISO and banks that are active in those arrangements are also on ISO, it could just lead to more transactions being carried over those systems as opposed to Fedwire and CHIPS. And then counterparties, they may decide to conduct transactions in other currencies in markets that have already adopted ISO. So if they've had to enable themselves to talk in ISO, to conduct business with these other markets, maybe they would even start conducting transactions in those currencies in the other markets. Again, moving away transactions from the U.S. dollar. So adoption of ISO in the U.S. could make it easier for global banks and corporates to conduct transactions in different markets. It could reduce costs associated with having to maintain multiple formats to accommodate markets that have not yet adopted ISO. And again, it could prevent, as we stated earlier, the migration of U.S. payments moving offshore, which could help the U.S. dollar remain attractive as a global currency. Moving on to the next use case on slide 25. So this use case relates to a single end-to-end payment file format. So on the payment origination side, in today's world, some corporations do already send commingled payment files in either an EDI 820 or even in an ISO 20022 format if they've already done so. And they instruct their banks, within this commingled payment file, they can instruct their banks to make various payment types, so wire, ACH, or check. And then once the banks receive the files, they need to convert those instructions to the appropriate proprietary format for the respective payment system. So again, there's a separate format for both wire systems. There's the Nacha format for the ACH systems, and then another format for check. So on the payment receipt side, banks then need to be able to receive different formats from the market infrastructures that they participate with. And then they need to convert those instructions yet again to other formats, such as a BAI format or a proprietary format, to deliver then the payment to the beneficiary. So there's a lot of mapping and reformatting going on because of the different formats involved in the U.S. So ISO has, the ISO format has sufficient data fields to support a single format for both high value, low value, and emerging real-time payments. So it's capable of, it has enough space and fields to accommodate the needs of different types of systems. So meaning the same format can be used across different systems, which would reduce a lot of the mapping and reformatting. So ISO, the common fields, so they have a whole suite of ISO 20022 payment messages, so that the same information can carried end to end. So there's, from the corporate to the bank, and then bank to bank over Fedwire or chips, and then from the bank to their corporate customer. So the same format can be used to support the different phases of the payment chain. And so a common format, again, could allow corporations, banks, and market infrastructures to exchange payment information in the same format, regardless of which system they're using to send the payment. So this is like the utopia of payment systems and message formats. And again, it certainly wouldn't happen overnight, but over time, moving to a common format could glean these efficiencies over time. So moving on to the next use case on slide 26. So this is related to extended remittance information. And as you all probably know, the U.S. doesn't have a common format for ERI today. So we have ACH systems. They use both a legacy ERI format, EDI or STT820, as well as XML and ISO 20022 remit. And then ERI for wire payments was introduced in November 2011, but adoption has been very limited. And really, I think what it comes down to is that the numerous ERI formats in the U.S. prevent the uptake in a consistent way because banks, corporations, and their vendors would need to make changes to support and maintain each of the formats. And I think that probably explains why the ERI adoption in the U.S. has been very low, because it would be yet another format to maintain and have to update. So ISO 20022, it provides a consistent format for ERI for all payment parties in the payment message. It could make the end-to-end adoption easier, which would increase, of course, the likelihood that when an originator sends ERI, the beneficiary can actually receive and process it, because, again, it's in a common format. And, again, the remittance capabilities in ISO, they have fields that can be carried over either a wire transfer system or an ACH system. Moving on to the next use case on slide 27. This one is about end-to-end payment tracking. And in today's world, each party in a payment transaction has limited visibility into the end-to-end transaction flow to ensure that a payment was successfully processed from the originator through the banks and market infrastructures to the beneficiary. And ISO payment and cash management messages contain fields, their status messages and return messages that would enable real-time payment tracking and reporting. So then it could allow banks to offer services to their customers where they could provide the status of payments throughout the payment chain. Moving on to the next use case, which is the last use case in our discussion. On slide 28, the final use case is related to diminishing legacy resources. So as seasoned format experts change jobs or retire, maintaining the staff with expertise in the legacy proprietary formats does become more challenging and costly, whereas if banks were to upgrade to a modern XML-based format, it could expand the knowledge base of formatting experts in the payments industry, because kids coming out of college and they're learning XML, and there's a wider pool of resources out there that understand and can program in XML. So moving on to slide 29, I just want to talk through some next steps. So the stakeholder group is still working together, and we'll be partnering throughout the whole ISO 20022 process. But what we are doing is we're separating into two different work streams, where we'll have a wire work stream and an ACH work stream. And on the wire work stream, representing the STED, it would be through the wholesale product office, which is the area I work in. The clearinghouse that operates CHIPS would participate, as well as X9. And then on the ACH work stream, we would have the Federal Reserve banks represented through the retail payments office. EPN, the clearinghouse is operator of EPN, NACHA, and X9. And as I mentioned earlier, the wire work stream is on a bit of a faster track than ACH. And what we're doing right now on the wire work stream is we're currently engaging with banks and vendors in SWIFT in discussions about ISO and possible implementation approaches and timeline. So we're conducting these webinars. And we've also met with vendors. We had a meeting last week with vendors where we started talking about different implementation approaches. And what we plan to do next is we plan to put together some additional webinars that talk about scope considerations and different implementation approaches and timing considerations. and we want to put together another webinar that will talk through all of this, and then have a survey which anyone could complete online where you could provide input to the scope, approach, and timing. So we're hoping to have those additional webinars and survey available within the next month or so. And we would be posting all of this information on the fedpaymentsimprovement.org website. So, many of you received a formal invitation to attend the webinar today. So we would envision sending out additional invitations, but you could also keep checking the Fed Payments Improvement website to learn about those additional sessions. And then what we would like to do next, after we gather all this information from the industry, the Fed and the Clearinghouse would like to conduct another joint meeting with our respective advisory group banks to share the information that we've gleaned through the webinars and the survey, and then start really mapping out a high-level implementation strategy and timeline. We are working with SWIFT to contemplate possibly doing a SWIFT meeting, an executive roundtable type of meeting, to build awareness and consensus on a proposed implementation approach and timeline. And then really this is all leading up to the CIBOS conference, which is in October, which is where the stakeholder group would like to be in a position to announce a high-level implementation approach and timeline. And again, I want to emphasize it would be a high level because, we would not be in a position to really formulate any details on an implementation plan or approach, but it would just be a high-level direction of where we think we're going with it, especially for wire transfer payments. And then, if possible, we would be able to include something around timeline as well. So on the next slide, just some reminders about how to get more involved. Clearly, the impact of any ISO adoption strategy for wire transfers is going to vary for each institution, and it's going to depend on how much in-house development do you do? Do you use vendor software? There's a lot of different considerations, and it's going to vary for each institution. So it's important for banks and vendors to be involved in the discussion. And as I mentioned, we will be providing opportunities for you to provide your thoughts on the implementation scope, approach, and timing. So please keep checking the fedpaymentsimprovement.org website to get information about these sessions. And then the next two slides provide additional information on the payment strategies work that the Fed is undergoing. So you can also continue to check the Fed Payments Improvement website to get information on those activities as well. So at this point, it concludes my formal part of the webinar presentation, and I would like to take some questions right now. I know some of you submitted questions in advance and have the ability through the webinar to submit additional questions. So we would be happy to go through the questions in our remaining time.
All right, thank you, Gina. It's Jean here again in St. Louis, and I just want to start with our first question. Actually, before I start with that question, I want to remind our listeners that they can ask a question just by simply clicking the Ask Question button in the webinar and type your question right in, and we'll get that queued up for Gina today. So, Gina, question number one. What are the differences in the ways ISO 20022 will be implemented by Fed, CHIPS, and SWIFT networks?
Okay, so right now we really don't have answers to that question yet. What we are doing, though, is we're working very closely with the Clearinghouse, and we'll be working with SWIFT as well to come up with a common implementation approach, particularly between FedWire and CHIPS. And so we're really looking to the industry to give us input on how we should do this, because the scope could vary very, very widely from, are we just going to do it for the payment message itself, or would we actually do it for all the different types of things that we communicate with our customers over our systems? So there's a number of, service messages and inquiries and responses and reports and statements. Would we convert everything to ISO, or would it simply be just the payment message? So these are the types of questions we're tackling with and that we want to delve into in our next series of webinars and the online survey that we're preparing. So we really don't have an answer yet, but I will say that we are looking to do it in a common approach so that it would be, again, to reduce the need for maintaining multiple mapping formats and to streamline the implementation, and so that we would be able to actually glean the efficiencies that could happen if we were to move to a common format.
All right, thank you. Our next question, what time horizon is being targeted for the complete transformation to ISO 20022?
That's a great question. We really don't have an answer on that yet because it really depends on what we actually do. It largely depends on the scope. The more we do with ISO, the bigger the scope, the longer the implementation time frame. If we did something simple, we'd maybe be able to accomplish that sooner. So again, it largely depends on the scope of what we're doing and our approach that we come up with. But I can tell you that due to other initiatives underway, both within the Fed and the clearinghouse, we would likely not be doing anything until no earlier than 2018.
Okay, thank you. Next question. How will government transfer payments be addressed, such a large portion of payments appear to have been ignored in this effort?
So when we're looking at ISO 2002 adoption for wire transfer system, we're including all payments that would be processed over the system. So we wouldn't be excluding any subset of payments, like government payments. I think it would be, at a minimum, we're going to be implementing ISO for the payment message. So it would be all payment messages that are traveling through our system.
All right, thank you. Our next question. ISO 20022 is a fairly broad standard. For example, SEPA implements a portion, but not all of the ISO 20022. How will the U.S. and the FRB go about choosing which portions of ISO 20022 will be implemented?
So this answer is similar to what I stated a few minutes ago, how we're really going to be working with the industry through the webinars and the online survey to determine exactly how we will implement the standard. And we will be collaborating with the clearinghouse so that we implement it in a common way. And the specific implementation will really largely depend on feedback that we get from the industry.
Okay, thank you. Our next question. Do you find multinational companies are more keen on migrating to ISO 20022?
Yes, absolutely, and this was covered in the business case assessment, that the predominant interest for ISO implementation was from the global banks as well as global corporations. And really it's because they're doing it, they have to do it anyway for other markets that they operate in. So if they're doing it for other markets, why not also do it for the U.S.? So for them, it's a pretty easy decision.
Okay, thank you. Our next question. How do we in the U.S. try and ensure that the implementation of ISO 20022 does not result in a new variant which is seen to be a huge impediment to format interoperability?
So this is a great question and something that also came out of the business case assessment, because for those of you who are familiar with ISO, different markets are implementing the standard differently. So then you end up without a standard. If everyone is doing it differently, then, what kind of standard do we really have? So this is a real issue out there. And SWIFT has become, immersed in the issue because they're working with different markets that are undergoing their ISO adoption efforts. And in April, they they brought together all the market infrastructures around the world, and the Fed and the clearinghouse both participated in this meeting at SWIFT headquarters in Belgium. And we all got together and we all talked about, what we're planning, or what some are actually already doing. And, there was definitely this awareness and interest to try to come to a common understanding of how everyone is implementing the standard and ways that we could, become more aware of what each other is doing so that we can consider all of that when we're coming up with our own ISO implementations. So I think, it has not been solved yet. There's a lot more work that needs to be done, but there's a definite awareness around it and a need to come to some type of consensus among how we're all doing it so that we end up with a common standard.
Okay, thank you. Our next question, is there a single global implementation that will be considered to be the source of inspiration for ISO 20022 adoption in the U.S.? For example, would we handle mandates similar to SEPA? Would credits be handled first, then debits?
So through this meeting that I just referred to in April, we have learned about how different communities are doing it. Some are doing a like-for-like approach where they're, like as an example, for Europe with their Target 2 system, their system today currently uses the SWIFT MT format. And what they're doing in their first phase, which is in November of 2017, they're doing a like-for-like implementation, meaning that they're just simply going to implement the SWIFT the ISO version of the SWIFT MT message. And then in a future phase, they plan on implementing enhancements. So that's one model. But then we also learned of other models out there where folks are considering, if they're going to do ISO, they're going to introduce it with enhancements because they want to right away take advantage of the benefits and the value of ISO by having more enriched data present in the message. So there's different models out there. And so we need to factor all that into our assessment of which approach we want to go with. And again, we're really looking to the industry to give us input on what they want to see. Do they want to see a more like-for-like approach, meaning the ISO version of our legacy formats, or do they, if we were to introduce ISO, would you want to see some value-added enhancements right off the bat? Or, is it better to move to that over time? So these are the types of questions that we will be including in our survey and in our additional webinars.
All right, thank you, Gina. Okay, our next question. Do you see ISO 20022 type messages being adopted through some of the newer and faster payments providers? And are there any efforts underway by ISO to ensure the format stays relevant and payments evolve?
Okay, so the first part of the question, I mentioned it briefly in the webinar today. I know that for the clearinghouse, in their proposal to develop a new, faster payment system, their intention would be to use the ISO 20022 payment messages in the design of that system. So I think, likewise, if anyone else was to build a new system and it's a brand new system from scratch, it certainly would make sense to do ISO 20022, but I'm not aware of other plans at this point, so the only one that I could really point to is the clearinghouse's real-time effort. So that answers the first part of the question. The second part about how we stay on top of ISO, the ISO has what's called a Payments Standards Evaluation Group, the Payment SEG, and the Fed and the Clearinghouse both participate on that group. And what that group is it's a group that really maintains the standard. And the group, they meet, they have calls every other week. They have a formal process to receive and review change requests to the standard and assess whether or not a change request would be approved. And they determine when the change will be introduced in the standard. So there's a whole formal process around maintaining the standard. And of course, if we were to adopt ISO 20022 for FedWire or CHIPS, we would be, we would continue to be very involved in that effort to make sure that, we're going with the latest version, and that we are making sure that the format accommodates all of the business needs for FedWire and CHIPS customers. In fact, as a step one, we really need to take a good look at our legacy formats and do an extensive mapping effort to the ISO formats and make sure that ISO can accommodate everything that we need for FedWire and CHIPS. And if it can't, then we need to go to this group to see if change requests can be approved so that the standard would meet all of our needs.
All right, thank you. Our next question, does the adoption of ISO 20022 alone make wire and ACH systems more efficient, or is it a necessary step to greater efficiencies?
So I don't know if adoption alone would make it more efficient, but what we learned from the business case assessment is, suggestions that adoption of a common format like ISO could reduce costs over time and increase efficiencies because, again, it could reduce the need to maintain mapping routines, and this enables participants to make changes more quickly and easily, and it can increase straight-through processing because of the structured fields that can carry data. So it seems like it certainly could make things more efficient over time, but again, it's all according to how you go about implementing it.
All right, thank you. Our next question, if we don't process our international wires through the Fed, will ISO 20022 affect us?
So again, this depends on a couple things. So if if we were determined that we're going to, for FedWire, we're going to change our format for ISO for everything, domestic and cross-border payments. So if you're sending FedWire payments for your domestic payments, then you would also need to accommodate the ISO format for the domestic payments. So if you're, sending, it sounds like what you might be doing is going through a correspondent, and so your bank, then it depends on, if you're going to your bank, a correspondent bank, instead of going directly to the Fed or the clearinghouse, if under that model, it's really going to be up to the bank. So the bank may have to make changes to interact with FedWire or CHIPS, but maybe from the bank to the customer, so yourself, for their correspondent customers, maybe they'll still support a legacy format and do a conversion for you. So it's hard to answer that question. It really depends on the implementation approach that the Fed and the clearinghouse come up with for our systems, but then also what the downstream banks, what they do with their customers, what models and approaches will they do with their customers. It's hard to answer that. And until all that information has been determined.
Okay, thank you. Our next question. Were there any U.S. interests involved in the original development of ISO 20022?
Yes, there were. Through this ISO, I don't know if it was the ISO payment seg at the time or if it was something else. There was some ISO group where it had participation from the Fed, I believe the clearinghouse as well, and then U.S. banks were involved in coming up with the ISO 20022 payment messages.
Okay, thank you. Our next question. Do we still refer to BAI format, or should we be using the new name for the updated standard, BTRS? I am not sure if banks are still using BAI. I know BTRS was created, and it's the preferred option, but I don't know if there are folks still using the old BAI format. I'm not sure. But the idea is, so speaking of BAI and BTRS, so the idea with ISO is that ISO 20022 has cash management messages, and the idea is that we would be moving away from all these other standards out there like a BAI, and folks would be moving towards ISO because the idea is ISO has messages that can go from the corporate to the bank, and then the bank to bank, through the market infrastructures, and then the cash management side from the bank to the corporate. So the idea is that the same, the similar fields can be present in all these different messages, that the information could be carried end to end, and it reduces the need to do all of this additional formatting from one format to another. So I think over time, the BAI and BTRS, if we really did move in the ISO direction, I think over time, the usage of BAI or BTRS would diminish. Okay, thank you. Our next question. Do you know where Mexico, South America, and China are on adoption of ISO 20022?
Off the top of my head, I'm not sure. I'm going back through my slides here to see if we identified any of those countries. So we didn't identify any of those countries in the global scan that the consultant did. So I don't have the answer to that off the top of my head, but I could definitely find out through SWIFT.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Our next question. It sounds like the Fed proposes using the existing connections between the Fed and the banks to exchange the ISO payment messages. Is this correct? Will any of the ISO messaging move to the SWIFT network?
Okay, so this is a good question. So I want to be very clear. At this point in time, I can speak only for the Fed. We are not looking at moving to the SWIFT network. We are going to be maintaining our own proprietary network. So we would be maintaining the FedLine Direct type of connection over our own network, which we call FedNet. We are not looking to moving to SwiftNet. But what we are doing is we're looking at being able to carry an ISO 20022 XML message over our network. So I think that was a very good question. I'm glad someone asked it because I want to be very clear about that.
Okay. Well, thank you for that response. This one may be similar, but I'm going to ask it anyway just in case it's not. Will SwiftNet be a Fed/TCH connectivity option?
At this point, at least for the Fed, we are not looking at also allowing SwiftNet.
Thank you. Our next question. ISO 20022 requires an XML message that represents the payment and receipt of the electronic payment. What is the best practice for organizations to ensure they comply with documents of record compliance and regulation?
Okay. Don't delete this from the screen yet. I need to read this. Because I can see these questions coming in. So give me a moment to take a better look at this question.
No problem, Gina. I'll just give our participants a quick reminder as you look through that question. If you have a question, please submit it to us by clicking the Ask Question button in the webinar tool, and I can get that queued up for Gina.
Okay, I really am not sure how to answer this question, so I think I would like to take it offline. And I do see the email of the person that submitted it, so I can get back to you directly.
Sounds great. Thanks for that, Gina. Okay, our next question. Does this move involve implementing IBANs for U.S.?
This is also a good question. I think it could. I think we could definitely at least put, because the ISO format does have, it does support the IBAN. So, and right now we don't have a specific field within Fedwire chips for the IBAN. So I think at a minimum we could have a place for it in our message.
Okay. I think I asked the last question, so I'm just going to take a quick peek and see if we have any new questions that have come in. And remember, if you want to ask a question to Gina, you can click the Ask Question button in our webinar tool. And Gina, at this time, I do believe that you have answered all of our questions. I'll just give the queue one more second to see if there are any additional questions that we will be adding in. Okay. Oh, there are a couple more questions. So our next question, Gina, is, when do you plan to bring in a corporate stakeholder to bring in a corporate perspective and to address corporate concerns? The current work group may consult with corporates, but that's not the same.
So actually, through the ISO stakeholder group, we are thinking of ways to involve corporates in the discussion. And I know one of the X9 representative that's on the stakeholder work group is working with the AFP to think about ways to get the corporate community engaged.
All right, thank you. Our next question. Considering there is no U.S. mandate, when do you estimate that ISO 20022 may be adopted for wired transfers and ACH in the U.S.?
I alluded to this earlier. We really don't have a date in mind yet because it really largely depends on the scope as well as the approach. I do know that it won't be before 2018. Just given other initiatives underway, both within the Fed and the clearinghouse, but I can't really say, when it will be implemented.
Okay, thank you.
And just to be clear, at this point, I can't even say what will be implemented because we're still identifying what we will do. I think we have an intention, and we've expressed an intention even through our payment strategies paper that I referred to at the beginning of the webinar. Our intention is to support ISO in some capacity, but we just, we have yet to determine the scope, approach, and timing. And what we're really doing is looking to the industry to help us come up with that. So we do encourage folks to, especially since for those of you on the call today, to really be, looking for the next series of webinars and participating and filling out the survey. Because we're really, and that goes to corporations as well. You'll have an opportunity to also complete the survey to express your views. So even if you don't learn about it through other venues. Just by being aware of this call today, you can stay engaged and be able to share your views.
Thank you. Our next question. Could you elaborate on repo transactions, please?
I really think that that's really out of the scope of the discussion today.
No problem. Our next question. How can American-based corporations drive change as most are reliant on their banking partners' service offerings and software provider templates?
So I think corporations can drive change by telling their banks what they want. I mean, I think it's, and vendors, I think they're looking for, vendors are probably more interested in this than anyone because it gives them an opportunity to, sell additional services to their customers. So I think corporates, they have a voice and they should be talking to their banks and vendors about what they're looking for and stay on top of this issue so that they know what's coming. And, I think corporations are ready to build something if there's demand from their customers.
Okay, thank you for that. Okay, we'll just do one more quick pause and let people know if they'd like to ask a question. They can submit that, click on that Ask Question button, and we can get that queued up for Gina today. I do see one more question in the queue. Is the U.S. behind the rest of the world in ISO 20022 adoption?
So I think the answer is yes, we are behind because what we learned through our business case assessment is that, there's a lot of ISO adoption activities already underway in other markets. And other, big markets like Europe and Japan, India, so there's Australia. There's a lot of activity already underway, and so we are a little behind, which is why we, embarked on doing this business case assessment and then taking it to the next step.
The next question. Has anyone tried to develop a way to evolve into an ISO 20022 format from today's format instead of trying to do one-time switch from one format to another? So I'm not sure I fully understand this question, but, I may have already addressed it in a prior answer that, we're not sure which approach we'll have. Will we do a big bang type approach with a one-day cutover, or will we allow a phased-in approach where we allow banks to phase into ISO over time? And, in a phased approach, we would be supporting both the legacy and ISO format. So I think maybe that's what this question might be trying to get to. So I hope that's a good answer. The next question, do you see ISO 20022 type messages being adopted through some of the newer, faster payment providers? Are there any efforts underway by ISO to ensure the format stays relevant as the payments evolve? So that's kind of a two-part question. The first part, I believe that, if a new system was to evolve in the U.S., like to support something like a faster payment system, if it was something brand new, I believe ISO 20022 would be used as the messaging format for that system. And as far as staying on top of ISO, so the ISO has a whole process for maintaining the standard and approving change requests to the standard, and the Fed is a participant on what's called the ISO Payment Standards Evaluation Group. And through that group, which has representation from participants around the world, that group is the body that receives change requests to the ISO payment messages, and then, discusses the request and votes on the request to see which ones would be approved, and then the standard is then updated accordingly. So the U.S. is involved in that effort. Both the Fed and the Clearinghouse have participants that sit on the payment seg. Actually, I'm the member of the Fed that sits on the payment seg. And so, I think we would be sure to, make sure that the ISO standard could accommodate, at a minimum, could accommodate what the Fedwire and the CHIPS formats today can accommodate. So part of our planning efforts, of course, would be doing an extensive mapping effort from our proprietary formats to ISO, which we actually have done. Years ago we did this, and we even have the information posted on the Fed's website. And we would need to validate that information because the standard has changed a bit over the years, and we would need to validate to make sure that everything in our current proprietary format can be accommodated in the ISO format. The next question, which is a very good question, to get full XML and the ISO 20022 to become implemented, who would be capable of making this a mandate? Since there are some fair strategies possible for domestic banks not dealing in global payments. So, yeah, this is a big issue. As uncovered in the business case assessment, the interest in ISO is largely among the global banks. And so banks that are domestically focused, they may not have an interest in adopting ISO. We do, if we are going to adopt ISO, and the intention is to move down that path to adopt ISO for the wire systems in the U.S., we do need to consider the implications on the smaller banks and the domestically focused banks. And the Fed, especially has this concern because while the CHIPS banks are really the global banks in the U.S., they only have about 49 participants, but these are the biggest banks, that probably do have an interest in adopting ISO. Whereas in Fedwire, we have 8,000 customers, and many of them are domestically focused and not really doing a lot of cross-border payments. So we do need to consider implementation strategies that consider the needs of the smaller institutions to make it easier for them to accommodate an implementation. So I think in our next round of webinars, we will be getting into these issues in more detail and looking at considerations for our different customer base. Then the final question is there a thought to first transition the interbank communication to ISO and then move to the corporate-to-bank communication? So, again, that also is related to implementation strategies. We're not sure yet what the strategy will be, but that certainly is a way to go where, where the strategy would be the interbank payments would become ISO first, and then over time, banks would be communicating with their customers in, I guess, a legacy format and ISO and migrate their customer base in phases. Another option is for even in the middle, the market infrastructures, we may decide to, have a phased-in approach where we're supporting both the legacy and ISO at the same time with an ultimate sunset date. I will say that I think any strategy that we select will probably involve some sort of sunset date at some point for the legacy format, because if you retain the legacy format indefinitely, then you never truly gain the efficiencies of a common format because you're still needing to maintain the legacy format. So I think any strategy we go with will ultimately have an end date for the legacy format. It's just, to be determined how long that sunset date will be.
Great. Okay, well, it looks like you have answered all of the questions today, Gina, and perfect timing, almost. You are giving 5 minutes back to everyone's day, so that's great. Did you have any closing remarks, Gina, before I close out our session today?
No, not really. Just, again, I just want to emphasize that, we have not yet determined our implementation approach or scope or timing. So there is opportunity for anyone to weigh in on what we're doing by participating again in future webinars and completing the online survey that we plan to post within the next month or so.
All right, great. Well, I'd like to thank all of our participants for joining us today, and a very special thank you to you, Gina, for presenting for us. This does conclude our webinar, and I hope everyone has a great day.